As designers, we are visual organizers. It's our job to determine what elements to use and how to use them effectively. Managing visual organization has many techniques, which we will discover in this chapter. Chapter 5 is all about managing effective design.
When looking at this, what's the first thing you see? Do you see a bicycle? Or do you see handlebars, pedals, spokes, tires, brakes, a seat, and a frame? If you're human, I'm guessing you saw a bike. This idea that we make sense of things by seeing a whole rather than the individual parts is called Gestalt psychology, and its principles are especially important for designers in creating complete and compelling visuals. Because of psychologists Max Wertheimer, Kurt Koffka, and Wolfgang Kohler, Gestalt theory can be broken down into 6 design principles. Figure ground. The thought that when we look at a scene, we separate objects so that some are the focus, or figure, and others are the background. Similarity. The notion that we place objects with similar characteristics in a group. These characteristics can include color, size, font, shape, texture, and more. Proximity. The belief that we group together objects that are close to each other. Closure. The idea that our minds close objects that are not necessarily together or complete in order to create a whole. Continuity. The theory that we continue to follow objects that are visually aligned until they are interrupted. Order. The belief that alignment and symmetry are attractive and essential elements of design. When Gestalt principles are ignored, designs tend to look out of place or incomplete, forcing our eyes to focus on little inconsistencies rather than the greater whole. You may not know exactly what seems off, but you will feel something is out of place. The best designs, unintentionally, make the world feel a little less chaotic.
The first part of this chapter goes over the theory of Gestalt. Gestalt simply means the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. I found a wonderful short video that goes over this concept. As in the video, I'll reiterate that Gestalt is the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Notice the example here, the shape of the individual elements and also the shape of the whole that it's created. In English, the interaction of design elements is more dynamic than each of the elements alone. Organization as a whole. So, organization as a whole has 4 primary considerations: format and orientation, underlying structure, eye movement, and theme and motif. From ideation to execution, each design decision must be supported by a rationale or a set of reasons, often choices we make intuitively because they feel right. Although it's important to trust your instincts, it's equally important to test them. So asking for feedback, like what we do in the critique process, is very, very important to make sure that your message and what you're trying to communicate is working. So let's first talk about format and orientation. And I believe that's just how it sounds. It's the way you're going to submit something and how something is going to be laid out. So your surface area that contains the composition, that is your design format. So for me, like in my job, I have web banner ads and I have print ads, and I have different specifications that have to be met by both. So for a web banner ad, I have 5 to 6 sizes it could be, all in pixels. And for print ads, for the most part, everything's got to be in CMYK, which we'll go over later in chapter 4. And has to be done in inches, and a bleed needs to be included if your image goes edge to edge. So knowing those pieces that of information are critical to making sure that your design works. I always like to say, design with the end in mind. So you may not know what that particular thing looks like or what it's going to be, but always ask those questions. Where is this going? How do I need to supply it? It's your job as a designer to make sure that you get all those specifications so that you can produce what's expected. just like the arrangement of design components, if they will be printed, cut, scored, and assembled. Check with the production house early or printer early. I always do that in the first step. When I'm doing the Myrtle Beach area visitor guide, I'm checking with that printer that we work with and we have a contract with months out. I'm probably not going to submit files till November, but in July, I'm asking to make sure that I have everything that's needed. And submitting test pages. There are a lot of times where I don't have the final product, but I have an approximate idea of how I want things laid out. And I'll go ahead and send an email to that print production house and say, here, this is a test sample. Run it through your department and make sure that I've got everything to spec here. So take a look at this example, and these are looks like saltwater taffy boxes, and so the design is very cool, and they have a very cool looking packaging. So you would definitely need to know the flat size, and you'd want to know what kind of die you needed to make. If you had a concept like this, the first place you start off at would be asking the printer for advice on how to lay this out for them, and also to make sure that whatever print house that is being arranged to be worked with, that they can actually handle this type of product. And here's another example of a really nice card, and the way that they have that laid out, it's clearly got an intricate die cut. That's something that you would need to have in advance of laying that out in order to get that, that layout done correctly. A few more points with format and orientation is make sure that you're keeping in mind the size of the screen. So there's several times where I'll make mobile banner ads, and so they're just like web banner ads, but they're much smaller. Make sure that when you're designing those that you're looking at the final product at 100%, because oftentimes when you've got something zoomed up really large on your screen, you think you can have all this content, and then you put it at 100% and you're like, whoa, that's way too much. You need to scale back. Make sure that you're always proofing your content in the actual size where it's going to be displayed. And even on monitors and TV screens, making sure that you preview those in advance can really help further your design. So in the design world, format is used in two different ways. It's the surface area that contains the design and the composition of the design itself. The shape, size, and general makeup of the format is determined by the venue or kind of design that it is. Packaging, like we've seen, publications, websites, posters, calendars, banners, and so forth. Venues are aligned and determined with the design objectives in mind, which means that formats are often outside the control of the designer. Many times I'm asked to do something and I haven't come up with the actual final product idea, but I need to make sure that whatever creative I have fits within that product. A good example of that would be any kind of vehicle wraps that I've done, or Pelican's bus wraps that I've done. I'm not necessarily buying the product, but I am making sure that whatever creative I have lays out on that vehicle exactly the way it needs to and communicates what it needs to. Take a look at this watch, for instance. It's an example of format and venue. Venue formats are often outside the control of the designer and can have a huge impact on the design as a whole. In this example, the designer was challenged to conceive and apply a cartoon character to the dynamic surface space of a watch. And here's this example where you're not only getting just the website and business cards, but you're getting door hangers, flyers, stationery, and other communications, postcards, so that they can communicate their business in many different messages. Lots of times as designers, you're going to have a similar message, but across many different venues. In this slide, I wanted to make sure I included something that really showed a larger scope of format for a designer. If there's anything that you take out of this particular chapter, copy and paste and use this format slide everywhere as a guide for you going forward. Making sure you consider the size, legibility, the use, sustainability, and the type of format you need to provide. You're going to always want to know these particular things. So when you're submitting something like a business card or stationery, you really want to keep that vector. So submitting it as a PDF or an EPS, encapsulated PostScript file, is probably the best way to go. When you're working on website design, an SVG, a PNG, and a JPEG are going to be the most compatible file types in order to get your designs to work. Same thing with additional banner ads and animations. Lots of times you're going to want to start in Illustrator. When I'm taking an animated title for my wedding videos, I usually build those in Illustrator and I animate them in After Effects. After Effects will import an AI file. Sometimes as designers, you're not going to be doing the actual animation, but you will be having to provide a logo or assets in order to get something created in a video. And you'll be required to know which formats work for which thing. So really take note of this slide because this is one of those important things that you'll probably always refer back to going forward. So let's take a look at this logo for Architectural Week. The architectural forms that we perceive to be most representative of architecture is rectangles and squares. So look at the letter forms and how their elongation and use of that type makes it look like a city skyline. It reinforces the periodical focus on architecture, therefore making a great logo for this particular publication. Grids have been used for centuries as a meaning of scaling smaller images to larger works or to breaking down the observed world into smaller, more manageable sections. For those same reasons, graphic artists today use the grid not just for that, but to align and lay out things in a very visually interesting and yet organized way. So grids can be built from square, arithmetic, rectangular, geometric, and triangular, and even varying sizes. The square arithmetic grid is composed of equal size squares, which you can do in a series of 1, 2, 3, 4, or however many you need. The geometric grid is composed of units that are built using multiples. Units might be 1 or 2 or 1 to 5 or 1.5. Grids also can be built from arithmetic progressions such as 1, 3, 5, and 7. Remember those rule of odds I was talking about? Sometimes the odd number of grid lines can be some of the most visually interesting layouts. So grids are one of my favorite ways to organize and make sure that I have things aligned. A grid is really going to help keep key alignments and intersecting points within a composition, therefore creating more visual interest. They also provide a means of organizing and determining where to place certain graphics and elements in imagery and type. Grid systems can also be combined and established to help establish a hierarchy to manage both the outer proportions and internal placements of the design elements. For example, the golden rectangle that I think we talked about last chapter can be used in conjunction with a set of arithmetic and geometric grids. There really are infinite ways in grid structures to use. I always recommend experimenting with different types. I have on this slide here some example grids that I use, and then I also have a link here for you if you wanted to investigate some other types of grids. This article that I've got here in this link is wonderful and pulls together a lot of different types of grids, grid structures, and how they work with each component. Here's a quick example of a website that's using a grid, and I think it's really important to recognize the fact that a grid doesn't just mean everything's in a square or a cube, but that there are different ways to break up that grid. So on the bottom where you see you have all those little squares, but you can tell that the bottom and the top are equally proportionate in size, and then you've got the white bar in the middle. It is definitely equally brought up and created, but because it's defined by the one big image in the top, the white banner, and then all of the little blocks, it has a nice visual interest, and everything is aligned. That makes things very aesthetically pleasing to look at, and that is, as designers, everything that we're looking for is to make sure that everything is communicated clearly and balanced properly. And a grid is really a great way to make sure everything is balanced. When you're designing, eye movement is definitely at the forefront of any layout. The eye works in conjunction with the brain to perceive the world. The best analogy I can give is the eye and the brain work like a movie camera. The lens works like the eye, and the film is like the retina on the visual cortex of the brain, recording the world and as it's perceived. However, one distinct difference between the eye and the camera lens is that the eye is continually moving or quivering, allowing the images that people perceive to be recorded in the retina. This quivering or rapid scanning of the eye is a built-in survival feature of human physiology that help people distinguish shapes, patterns, colors, and therefore it's difficult to maintain a fixed stare on any one point with one photo. The tendency is for people to want to move their picture as they perceive the rest of the image in their peripheral vision. Controlling eye movement in a composition and then a matter of directing the natural scanning tendency of the viewer's eye is every designer's goal. And the eye tends to gravitate towards areas of the most complexity first. In pictures of people, the eye is always attracted to the face, and particularly the eyes. The combination of graphics complexity in a face and the fact that the face embodies the essence of a human expression leads the eye to examine faces for clues about meaning. Light and dark contrasts create distinct shapes and lines that attract the eye. Vertical and horizontal lines or edges are stable, functioning as constant axes. Angled lines and edges and alignments that operate counter to vertical and horizontally guide the eye movement. An effective strategy to establish is a visual hierarchy to direct the eye movement. A rhythmic loop can be created that takes the eye on a journey over the surface into the depths of the composition with a built-in resting place or white spaces. Textures and graphic detail can offer the eye a reason to sustain interest and examine the pictures again. In this book jacket, the viewer's eye is immediately drawn to the face, particularly the subject's eyes, which is cast downward to the book jacket's title, therefore being an effective use of eye movement. Here's viewing the same book jacket, but as if you would view it in as a book. So here's the cover, which I think has the same powerful impact as then when you saw the flat. And then I'm going to show you in the next slide the back of the book jacket. And you can see the back of the book jacket has an equally powerful impact because those eyes are looking towards the front of the book jacket. Here's a great example of some visual hierarchy and how you read things going through a page. I think this slide is pretty self-explanatory. You read the big bold line first, then you read the smaller line second, and as it goes. However, that phrase, unless a phrase is bolded, that is bolded and it's a little bit big, it does gravitate and give you some more weight in that section. That is called an anomaly. An anomaly is when you break the flow of your hierarchy. Let's talk a little bit about theme and motif. These two concepts work hand in hand with each other, and motif, I often think, helps enhance a theme or an idea. Theme in design is a subject or topic being represented, and a motif is an inherent pattern or arrangement of an overall image that supports the theme. I'm going to list a few examples in the next slide to help further enhance exactly what theme and motif are, and they oftentimes motif has a cultural or historical reference to it. Here are some examples of motif, one from the Elizabethan era, which is historical, and a lot of the architecture that they used had these very elaborate, ornate patterns within them. It's similar to an Italian motif, which is over to the left of that. You see it's got a lot of pattern and a very regional tie to it, as well as the other example on the right, the Celtic or Celtic ornate structures there that are tied into what a theme and a motif would be. Non-objective imagery, these images have no resemblance to anything recognizable. These images are built from geometric and natural elements that make no attempt to depict anything in the real world. So let's take a look at this image that I have here on this slide. This non-objective image relies on the shape relationships, and they form a visual vocabulary that communicate what's happening. There's a lot of tension that's created between these images, between the sharp points of the shapes and the edges. It looks like if one were to fall, then they would all just come tumbling down. They're all just held on with the tension of a few little points. The prevailing feeling conveyed in this here is the relationship between the shapes is a sense of confinement and incompatibility. The tension there is definitely communicated in this example. So it's more about the feeling that you get from this non-objective imagery rather than the actual realistic type of imagery that we're going to talk about in the next slide. Let's take a look at this example of non-objective imagery use in a poster. So this poster is promoting an art gallery opening. Ask yourself, how does the eye move here? What is this poster actually advertising? Is it more artistic or functional? Abstract images resemble a physical world but are a simplification or a distortion of the things in it. Let's look at this example here. The identity for the Vanderbilt University integrates the oak leaf and the acorn within the V letter form to symbolize the seed of knowledge, strength, and steadfastness. And realistic imagery, well, I think that's just as it sounds, imagery that replicates the real world in a descriptive manner. If you look at this illustration from the New York Times Book Review, it's an example of realism or representational imagery, which involves an exaggerated project in an editorial point of view as a caricature of Neil Young. The next part of this chapter, we're talking about visual relationships, and we're going to spend quite a few minutes talking about the different terms of visual relationships and the different arrangements that you can have within a layout or design. Controlling the relationships of visual elements is the art of aesthetic judgment. Making decisions about where elements should be placed and how they should be placed on a page is a measure of intuition and logic. Both should be used. There are three types of figure and figure ground basic arrangements: simple, figure ground reversal, and figure ground ambiguity, as well as closure, which is exactly how it sounds, the condition of being closed. Taking a closer look at simple figure ground, this is where the arrangement or layout and presence of shapes are arranged in a way that serves as the ground. The space can be compressed or shallow, or it can create the illusion of depth. Let's take a look at this poster, for example. All of the elements are placed against a neutral background to allow for the distinctiveness of each element to read clearly with the others. Figure ground reversal. This is one of my favorite effects. This is a graphic effect in which the figure can function as ground and ground as figure. The shapes and the form and the space cause you to see an in-between image. So look at this example where we're looking at the pen, and you could see a musical note in the reverse of the pen. The image reversal yields a visual solution that offers the economy of combining two images into one. I think these are most clever. I love figure ground reversal. Anywhere I can try and use them, I think that they end up coming across as very authentic too. Figure ground ambiguity. This one is a tough one to say, but has a lot of punch in perception and concept. The viewer, while looking at this, finds the relationships between the forms a little uncertain. Takes a minute to really figure out what this one is and what it means. The trick to controlling figure ground ambiguity is to effectively create an arrangement that is disorienting yet comprehensible. That's what makes this type of visual relationship so interesting, is that it creates a certain amount of mystery. Let's take this Earth Day poster, for example, as an example of figure ground ambiguity. In this poster, the positive image of the mother and the profile of the head, as well as the kiss to the earth, engage the viewer in a visual mystery of form and concept. It creates such visual interest, it pulls you in and makes the eye want to be there a little bit longer. Here's another example of that type of figure ground ambiguity. You see the Batman, and it almost looks like at first glance that maybe those are flames, but if you turn your head to the side, you're going to see that the Joker is actually within that negative space, creating a lot of visual interest. Next, let's talk about closure. So closure is exactly how it sounds. It literally refers to the condition of being closed. But in this situation, it's more about how your eye wants to visually close something that may not actually be closed, and therefore creating some tension and visual interest. Look at the series here of the St. Louis Arc and how your eye wants to put that arc together. That is a great example of closure. Closure can also mean the relative position of where certain objects or shapes are to one another. Let's look at this one, the creation of Adam. You see that this is where God is about to give Adam life. Well, that tension and closure, wanting that finger to touch that other finger to create life, is an example of closure. Pay extra attention to this because I'm sure I've seen this one on a midterm sometime. Let's take a look at this example of closure. So as you can see, the E is way far away from the rest of the star, and the angle of the star point is a little bit lower than it should be. However, even though this is a huge gap in between where the rest of the pieces are contained and where the E and that one triangle is, our angle, it still creates a version of closure that creates tension that we've been talking about so much. So your mind's eye really wants to put that angle and the E where it's supposed to be in order to complete that star and the word closure. So yes, this is an example of closure. A couple more techniques when we're talking about visual relationships and how to bring some visual interest into your designs is contrast and anomaly. Most of you know what contrast is and have some sort of preconceived notion. It's the relationship between light and dark, but it's also the relationship of shapes and how they are juxtaposed to one another. An anomaly is the presence of an element or a visual relationship that is unlike the others and that dominates the composition. Let's look at the example on the upper left, the one with the straight lines and the curved one in the middle. The vertical appears to be more curved because of the curved line in the middle. therefore creating a tension in that image and a different type of contrast than we're normally thinking about. The other two examples are a little bit more straightforward in the fact that contrast is in like the colors. So look how that bee pops off the cream colored versus how it pops off the gray color. The gray is a little more muted, whereas that yellow color really pops it. And the last image on this page is really contrast and rhythm. The rhythm of the large circles and rectangles is supplemented by the rhythm of the smaller circles and the diagonal lines, which can also be read as maybe small rectangles. The flow of visual shapes within this image creates contrast between the images and makes your eye move. Here's an example of a visual anomaly. I think visual anomalies are easier to be shown than described, so I want to make sure that I spend some time. As you can see, these four squares are the same shape and size, but having that 1/4 square arranged on an angle is diagonally different from the others creates the visual anomaly. That square on an angle creates a focal point and a focus for the eye to move within the logo, as well as creating a little bit of tension. Emphasis and focal point, these really work together, and the eye tends to return into one point, and the emphasis is where you're trying to make that eye return to. Space and illusion is, well, exactly how that sounds, space and illusion. How you place your other elements in relationship to that element is going to create an illusion of size or depth. See these examples on the side. We're going to go over those in a little bit, but those are examples of size, of space and illusion. In this example of the Müller-Lyer illusion, the line segments between the angles in and the angles out are mathematically equal, although you view them as being mathematically unequal. The explanation for this is based on a person's intuitive understanding and depth perception. The angles in are associated with closer, and the angles out are associated with further away, therefore creating that illusion. The second illustration on the bottom, it really refers to depth. The line segments that cross the two converging lines exist in a context that you associate them with farther away. Visual illusions based on linear and overlapping perspectives are both really cool and sometimes a hard concept to understand, and how they relate to one's eye and how you're viewing your piece. Let's look at the boxes to the left. They are examples of depth ambiguous figures. These figures present an open form without a background, but you can flip the back and the front in either way you look at this. If you look towards the middle with the 4 circles and the red maroon circle in the middle, that red and maroon circle looks a lot smaller next to those larger black circles. And yet on the other side where you see the smaller black circles, that maroon circle looks bigger, but it's not. They're both the same size. They're creating a visual illusion. Same thing goes for the box at the bottom. You see the black circle in the yellow box. Those black circles are all the same size. However, because you give the circle more space on the right with a bigger rectangle, that circle appears smaller than the one onto the left that has a smaller size and a smaller box. The next few slides go over some really cool art and illustrations that further the visual illusion section of this chapter. So enjoy the next few images as examples. So now let's discuss the design criticism model, the 4 levels. The 4 levels can be found on page 184 and 185 of your book, but they're description, analysis, interpretation, and judgment or evaluation. A work of art and the process of critiquing is one of the most important processes you're going to go through in a visual art education experience. When we critique a work of art, we don't just say, oh, I like that, or I don't like that. And it's certainly okay to have an opinion to like it or not like it, but we want to give an informed, disciplined, and well thought out evaluation of the work as a whole before we come to a judgment. At the University of Georgia, a professor, Edmund Feldman, came up with the 4 processes that we're studying here today: the description, analysis, interpretation, and evaluation/judgment. As you elaborate on your points, don't forget to use your art vocabulary. I want to hear you talking about elements of design, principles of design like hierarchy, balance, rhythm, proportion, unity, variety. I want all of those things to start becoming a part of how you describe artwork, how you describe your graphic design projects, and how you use them in these critiques. So the first level of the critique process is description. This is not interpreting, it's just factual. Answer these questions. Who is the artist? What's the art titled? When and where was this art created? What is the subject? Is the art non-objective or realistic? What kinds of shapes, lines, colors, textures do you see? And what is the medium and media? You're just analyzing exactly what you see at this point. The second level is analysis, and this is where you're really going to discuss the use of principles of design, hierarchy, unity, theme, proportion, variety, balance, movement, orientation, dominance, scale, and you're going to discuss the elements of design: the shape, the form, size, color, texture. These are the things that you're going to discuss, how well they are used. We're also going to discuss the appropriate use of the media that's been used, whether for business cards, logo on business cards, TV, billboard, web ad. Discuss whether the media was used in the appropriate way and whether the artwork is effective based on the media that they chose. In the third level of design, we're going to be talking about interpretation. What is this artwork or graphic design project trying to say or communicating? Finding the meaning within the images. Is the image communicating a specific viewpoint? Does it have a political message? Does the image stand for something else? Does the image physically or perceptually resemble or imitate anything that it refers to? Does it have an image signifying a connection to a physical event? Can an image observe from a variety of different viewpoints? We're going to look at a couple examples of that in a minute, but really taking a look at what is the artwork or graphic design project saying or stating. What is the communicating message? And then level 4 is evaluation, and this is really more of on a personal part of the critique. This is where you're going to state whether you think this piece does work or it doesn't work. Is the message effective? Based on your rationale, how do you perceive this particular project? Here's a statue using the 4 levels that we just learned. To yourself, critique what this means. What is this sculpture and what it means to you? This sculpture was actually created to be a representation of Image's flight, and or a bird taking off a flight. And so the organic shape and nature is supposed to make you feel like weightless and floating through the air. So that's what the artist wanted you to get out of it. But you yourself should go through the 4 levels of the critique process and see what you get out of it. Here's another example by Georgia O'Keeffe. This is another thing that you got to go through the creative process on. How do you view the image? What are you seeing? What kind of forms, textures, colors, lines, all of those pieces? What do you see? when was this done, do a little bit of analysis on your own, and come up with what you think about this particular piece. If we were having a traditional class, I would ask everybody to give their opinion, but in this online class, I'm going to need for you to do that on your own. So in summary, you should really feel that you've gotten a little bit more information on managing effective design, organizing the design and the relationship between elements, as well as the visual relationships that you can create throughout your layouts, and also about the design critique model and how to further use that in your life going forward, especially as designers. When we get through the critiquing process, or when we get to critique our work together, we're going to want to make sure that you're using the 4 steps in order to critique, and that you're not just saying, oh, I like it, or no, I don't like it. Make sure you're always evaluating your own work. When you are coming up with your process books, make sure that you're integrating some of those techniques of the critique model on your own. And force people, ask questions when you are asking someone who is not part of this program and doesn't know about the design critique model. Ask them questions as they're looking and reviewing your work that's going to further help you. So asking whether or not they see certain items that you want them to see, and getting that feedback is going to be crucial into creating great designs in the future.